her do her introduction, so please welcome her, please.
That reminds me of our first panel, where I think we had a slide presentation of a full circle and thinking about how chronic recitations can complete a full circle. And so, Professor Ware, I want to remind us of this complete circle.
Don't forget to introduce yourself.
I will, it's going to come. So I met Professor Ware, this is probably maybe 7 years ago. I was arriving in Michigan with a very fragile dissertation about Black evangelical movements moving between the post-Reconstruction South and colonial Africa, and trying to find another way to name Black faith inside of diaspora. And I came and I gave a really tentative job talk, but it was enough to remind me that I was writing for a reason. And I went back home thinking that I can complete this dissertation maybe, and there will be something on the other side of this research. And in the middle of me trying to reconnect my work to my faith, I got an email from Professor Ware, who told me that we should talk. And he was telling me that there's a possibility for you to see your work into completion by coming to the University of Michigan. And I told him no. And he told me, why don't we actually have a conversation by phone? And one evening, as he and his wife were tending to their babies, he let me hear him encourage me to think about a way of walking into a future that you cannot see for yourself. And I want to thank you so much for that. I've been asked, as an outsider from the fields of expertise gathered today, to give a witness of what I've heard and seen over the last 3 days. And so I've been trying to keep notes to help put into some sort of story what it is that I've witnessed with you over the last 3 days. Part of what I've heard in our conversation about the esoteric sciences is a recursive longing for nearness. A nearness that reaches beyond a material plane, a nearness that grapples through the volatility of structural dominance that we've known to name white supremacy. The kind of structural dominance that assumes the name and form of anti-Blackness that we've been watching unfold before us all of these many years. And it's a longing for a nearness that can be repositioned the way we think about our communities of belonging inside of a brutally profane world. As I was thinking about how your conversations yesterday positioned me differently to think about the work I can do, even though I can't always see it into completion, I was reminded of another moment that was more lonely and more dark about 2 years ago. I was in Washington, D.C. doing some research at the Library of Congress. A lot of my work deals with the fragile writing of formerly enslaved Black people trying to make petitions to the U.S. state to save them, even though the U.S. state was complicit in their demise. And I was trying to read these fragile letters that the Library of Congress has archived, but has not actually put into a kind of critical practice to talk about the complicity of the U.S. state, as the 50th commemorative march on Washington was taking place. So I'm inside the Library of Congress, and there's a gathering on the National Mall asking us to remember what Martin Luther King and all of the many activists who gathered in the mall in 1963 were trying to inaugurate for us as a kind of political discourse. And I had this confrontation. I need to finish the research inside of the Library of Congress, but I think maybe I also have to bear witness to what's taking place outside of this archive. And it reminded me that some of the ways that we do our history has to confront how the impression of the past is literally taking shape right in front of us, and a willingness not to enclose that history inside of the archive. So I stayed in the middle ground, reading the letters written in the 1860s from besieged Black people, and trying to think about what that meant for witnessing besieged Black people gathered one more time on the National Mall. This 1963 march had a script to it that was put into a different motion in 2013. And I was trying to think some more about how to untangle that script, to have a way to deconnect Black faithfulness from the profanity of the U.S. state. And so I went back and I watched the commemorative address, I should say, that was given right before Barack Obama took the stage. I don't know if you all remember how this commemorative event happened. But Bernice Reagan, the complicatedly grieving daughter of Martin Luther King, was asked to speak in the space of her father before Barack Obama came onto the podium. And I was especially interested in the way that Sister Bernice King was trying to think about a remnant theology. What happens to those who have survived the catastrophe and are trying to will themselves into a community under the order of God's good grace? Bernice King wasn't actually able to reproduce the oratorical cadence of her father's prophetic voice, that kind of cadence that we remember helped got Barack Obama elected. But she was very deliberate in the ways that she spoke between historical memory and biblical time to think about the remnant of the beloved community. She was trying to conjure a holy land and a holy people through the aftermath of prophetic text. And the basis of her speech came from the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. So I'll just talk a little bit about Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah begins in catastrophe. After the Jeremiah has been fulfilled and the sinful people of Judah have been exiled, the walls of the beloved city of Jerusalem have been laid to waste. Nehemiah hears of the remnant returned from exile, living in shame and danger in Jerusalem. After months of prayer and fasting, prophet Nehemiah receives a vision from God. He petitions the king of Persia for permission to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and the gates of this holy city. While some members of the remnant, those who have survived the catastrophe, reassemble the walls, others are told to stand guard against the enemy. And Nehemiah tells the people to listen for the blast of a trumpet, because when that trumpet blasts, danger is about, but that trumpet also reminds that God will fight on their behalf. When Sister Bernice King invoked this scriptural text in 2013, she was standing beside a large bell. So she's on a podium and there's this prop beside her that's the large bell. And when she got to the part of the story that reminds us of the trumpet, there was an orchestrated ringing of bells all across the United States. It was supposed to remind us of that critical line in Reverend King's sermon about Let Freedom Ring. But as I was hearing that kind of scripted performance of the scripture inside of the commemorative commemoration, which happened in between the acquittal of George Zimmerman for Trayvon Martin's death and the murder of Renisha McBride at a neighbor's front door, I wondered about what kind of political apostasy, a rejection of the state, would allow us to knock over the bell. I have not actually been able to complete this meditation, but you have given me the courage over the last 3 days to return to it. And when I return to this meditation, I've been thinking about the ways that part of the work we do differently and together could be a way to remind us that Black ontology, set apart from the United States notions of democracy, has still been used to set a progressive plot line for US liberalism that has been historically caught up in asking Black people to perform God's grace upon a profane state, to be a living sacrifice for a profane state. And it means that maybe in this silence, if we knocked over the bell, part of what we can think about our last 3 days together is to remind ourselves that we are enacting a different kind of radicalism. A radicalism that's not intending to make our research a petition for the state, but to remind us that in our different ways of understanding something that goes beyond the material world, we make love. And I thank you for
that. Thank you so much. Could we please give another round of applause? At this point, we will move forward, and he needs no introduction.